This time in the Magick Kitchen, we are joined by Morpheus Ravenna.
I'm Leandra Witchwood.
And I'm Elyse Wells.
And welcome to the Magick Kitchen podcast, where we talk about magic, kitchen witchcraft, herbs,
and everything in between.
As you may know, the Magick Kitchen podcast is fully and independently funded by the Witchwood Tea House. So show us some support and head over to thewitchwoodteahouse.com to purchase some deliciously hand-blended loose leaf teas or one of my other botanical products. As a special thank you for your support, please use POD15 at checkout to take 15% off of your next order. So without any further ado, let's get to the episode. Blessed be.
Morpheus is a genderfluid sorcerer, artist, and writer residing in the East Bay area of California. She is a dedicant of the Morrígan with a practice rooted in animism, folk magic, and Celtic polytheism. An initiate of the Anderson Feri tradition of witchcraft, she has practiced devotional polytheism and the magical arts for over 25 years. She is the author of The Book of the Great Queen and a priest and co-founder of the Coru Cathubodua Priesthood. Visit her at bansheearts.com. So welcome. We are really happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm honored.
Yeah, we're glad we were reading your Magic of the Underworld book, and I'm like consumed by this. I love this book. I'm gonna go read it again and again.
Oh wow. Thank you. I'm glad you like it.
Yeah. And Elyse and I, we probably have a ton of questions, but I know we're not gonna get through all of them. So we'll do our best to cover the meaty parts.
Okay. Sounds good.
And I like your book because it's got I mean this in a good way. Like, I'm a person who pays good money to sit in lectures in the front row. You know what I mean? Like, I like my pen out, ready to go early. You have the air of an academic, professional professor vibe mixed with the most practical Celtic book I've read in a long time. You don't waffle around. You're like, here we go. We're going to do this right. But you're also like, here are several different texts that tell you where this right came from, which is so good. I really love how well sourced this is.
Yeah. And you mentioned in the book, it's hard to really get accurate, Celtic cultural references or study material, or I mean, because it's been so watered down. It's been so
the source material is really tangled up.
Mm-hmm.
The pagan layer or the pagan period of any of the Celtic cultures wasn't documented in a textual way. They didn't write down their literature. So we have to look at material that was, committed into writing by Christians after the conversion period. And we have to kind of piece that together with archaeology and, maybe some threads of what has stayed alive in folk practice. But that's a long, time distance. And so it is kind of this reweaving. I think I find it helpful to just not have illusions about reconstructing or rebuilding what was, because I don't think we can do that. We don't know enough, and we aren't those people. So my approach is more like I'm trying to drink from the well of what we can possibly know about the roots of these traditions, and then create something that's inspired by that.
Yeah. And honestly, I appreciate that even on the cover, you're like modern sorcery, because in the world, we were talking a little bit about this before we started, but in Greece, where I live, Witchcraft is very much like subjugated still. And weirdly, there are people that try to do Reconstructionist Hellenistic practices, but they're extremely exclusionary. They're very racist. They're extraordinarily xenophobic. And they actively lobby in our politics here to keep other pagans, anyone who's not of these three official organizations, from being able to do anything. So yeah, Reconstructionism is like not my favorite. And it is a misnomer. We can't do it. Even in Greece, where we do have some primary sources, it's all from Attica and it's so limited, and it's not, we don't actually know what they were saying. Like, eye of newt is mustard seed. We know some of this stuff, but like some of what they're saying, we don't really know. Like it's such a misnomer to even suggest that someone,
Yeah. And, I'm friends with folks who think of themselves as Reconstructionist. So I understand what they're trying to do. But for me,
I just dream.
Yeah. Well, somebody that I respect a lot said, like, Reconstructionism should be thought of as a method of study,
Ooh,
and
yeah.
then and so like that's just like how you recover material about what was in the past, but you still have to create something fresh. Yes. And you were talking about like these backward looking groups, and I think that there is kind of that ideological danger zone with any kind of religion or spiritual community that is focused on the past. It's really easy for that to get co-opted by this sort of fascist ideology of like the modern world is terrible and we need to return to traditionalism, which is always being interpreted in this very exclusive bigoted way. Like there's a way where we need to take care with our interest in the past, that it's not turned into that kind of like traditionalism that is so dangerous
and toxic. And I think a lot of it is romanticized too,
Yes.
I mean, look at the Pirates of the Caribbean movement. Like that was so romanticized, but being a pirate was actually gross and hard.
And pirates were gross.
Yes.
They were rapists, pedophiles.
I know. I was trying to explain this to my son who's 14 and he loves pirates. He's like, I want to be a pirate. I'm like, no, you don't. You really don't.
Yeah, I agree that romanticizing past societies is, that's sort of like where that danger zone starts. That's we have to be really careful of that, and like, being really clear that our religious practices are not about like cosplaying a romanticized vision of the past that we're trying to return to, because it's really easy for that ideology to get co-opted and
definitely.
Yeah. And, I feel like for me as a polytheist, what's important is it's relationship, right? And so whatever brings vibrancy and connection into my relationships with my gods and spirits in the here and now is valuable to me. Whether it is historically rooted or not, I just happen to be like a, I'm like a crow, like with shiny things, like, things from historical lore and tradition are like shiny things for me. I love it. But, what the test of what is helpful is sort of like, does it feed relationship? Does it come to life?
Well, and that brings me to like one of the chapters I had open here, which maybe there's something going on that you're picking up what I'm looking at here, but you have chapter 3, which is spirit work and spirit alliances, where you talk about animism and reciprocity. And this was I think this is such an important topic. Can you tell us about your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have an awareness of spiritual realities and spirits, you sort of come alive to the fact that the whole world is haunted. And I say that like,
that. Yes.
not in a fearful way, but like there, everything is filled with beings, and we have the ability to walk through the world like that. And to me, that really it is empowering, it is nourishing, it makes us, it helps you to realize we're not alone. And there are a lot of potential allies out there. And, of course, that also means there are risks. Like the I think of the spirit world as like an ecology, in the same way that like we're surrounded by all kinds of creatures and some of them are dangerous to us or can be. I think the spirit world is the same way. It's an ecology. So there's a lot of complexity there. There's very regional variation. There are lots of different kinds of beings all around us.
Yeah, and I know people get freaked out and terrified on that visual, like, oh my gosh, I'm being watched, or there's always dangers around me. But I always think of it like you are okay, so you're out in your yard and there is a wasp next to you. You're not bothering the wasp, so the wasp's not going to bother you, but you're existing in the same place together. And I think that's an important perspective for people who are terrified of spirit, who are terrified of, quote unquote, I'm got my air quotes out, guys.
Yeah.
Evil spirits that are just seeking to attack you. Like that wasp is just trying to do its job. It's trying to mind its own business and feed the colony and feed the queen and the babies.
Yeah, I mean, if the idea of being surrounded by spirits makes you feel anxious because you're being watched, it might help to realize that, maybe a lot of them don't actually care that much about you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You're really not that important to them
until you cross a boundary. And that's how I've always worked with spirits, is that if you cross that boundary repeatedly, you're going to get stung. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I find it helpful to remember that the concept of evil, as a sort of dualistic, hard, binary of good and evil, it doesn't fit very well in polytheism to me. Like, to me, that sort of is part of the monotheistic worldview.
Yes.
And I think, we're saturated by that. So you have to kind of do constant, it takes a kind of a constant awareness and effort and practice to restore yourself to an animistic and polytheistic worldview, where it's like, just because something can harm me doesn't mean it's evil. It might want to harm me for its own reasons, but that doesn't actually make it morally evil. It might just be that it is hungry, or it has agendas and drives that I don't understand or that are dangerous to me, but that doesn't mean it's morally evil.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Real talk. Leandra and I could be trying to sell you socks or a VPN or that cereal everybody talks about, but we like to keep it witchy around here instead. And we can only do that because of the support of listeners like you. When you're joining my Magical Living community on Patreon, you're not only getting weekly shadow work journal prompts, new moon and full moon rituals, exclusive videos, exclusive meditations, plus bonus episodes of the Magick Kitchen podcast, but you're seriously keeping the lights on in the Magick Kitchen. Thank you for listening and reviewing the show. And if you're ready to meet me in the Magick Kitchen, pop over to patreon.com/Elyse Wells and start your free trial. Let's deepen your magical practice together. To continue on this definition of animism, I felt like your book, The Magic of the Otherworld, really takes animism, I would say takes a hard animistic approach. Like you discuss inspiriting sigils with lights. And some people might be animists in more limiting ways. So could you, I guess in your words, what is an animist approach from a Celtic perspective in your experience?
Yeah, well, I guess what I would say is, I think that there is life in everything. Everything has like life energy in it, even things that we would think of as inert. And there's like a spectrum from life energy that is just sort of raw life force to spirits that have individual awareness and consciousness and cohesion as a being. And so all of these things are part of the world around us. So like if the question is about like what's going on when you are inspiriting something or bringing a sigil to life, is that kind of what you're
Yeah.
asking about?
Yeah. And like, yeah, just the more, because I feel like for most people, and some people don't actually consider animism or talk openly about animism, like it's either assumed knowledge or
Mm-hmm.
it is, it's presented as like, oh, well, all witches see souls in creatures. Okay, well, that's probably true, but not all witches see souls in um their athames, for
Right.
example. And soul might not be the word, really. It's because I
Yeah.
agree, and that's why I'm asking your side on animism, because people ask all the time, like my work is with land spirits, and that's
Mm-hmm.
a tough explanation,
Yeah.
because what are land spirits? Well, it's the land itself. There's also the elders of the land, the trees, the boulders. There's also, maybe at your land is also a spring, so there's the water spirit. So a land spirit is not like a singular thing, but it's also not a deity. Like, it doesn't care about your individual conversation that you had at work that made you upset, but it does care that your energy is off and it wants you to calibrate that
Yeah.
back. Whereas like, yeah, a
Yeah.
deity would. So it's like a
Yeah, I mean, I
whole,
guess the way that I think of it is like life force is in everything and all around all the time, right? And it coalesces into forms, right? It coalesces into um lasting, I guess you'd say, constructs, and that becomes a being, right? And those can form around processes, they can form around
or like an
places.
egregore.
Yeah, or that's really what we are. We are
Mm.
a coalescence of life force operating a body. And that life force has formed into a set of spiritual anatomical systems that interact with our body and can go on to have a life after death. Don't necessarily, like, all the parts of our spirit don't necessarily disperse on death, but some part of us does. So yeah, to me, like, I don't know, this is kind of like weird mystical stuff that is hard to put a language to, but that's kind of how I see.
Yeah.
And I feel like, we it's hard to say what the ancient Celts, what any of the ancient Celtic cultures thought. But when you look at the artwork, that's where I really see that animistic perspective, because the artwork is a lot of like one thing swirling into another. And it's a lot of these like organic, spiral or plant-like forms, or just like what they call plastic geometric, where it's just like very fluid shapes that move from one thing to another, and faces emerge in them, but in this very amorphous way where it could be viewed in different ways. And to me, that art style is very evocative of this sort of understanding that life kind of moves through forms, and is in all things, um, but is connected to itself, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Well, and that brings me to the section of the book where you talk about the three realms.
Mm-hmm.
And that I was like, oh, somebody's talking about it. Yay, because
Yeah.
that's what I work with too, is these three realms. And
Uh-huh.
um I see the fluidity in those realms. Even as we live and breathe, you can sense it, you can work through it, you can work with it. Tell our listeners a little bit about the three realms from your perspective.
Yeah. So this is one of these themes that shows up in different Celtic contexts in similar but distinct ways. There's like this sort of running theme of the cosmos as a whole is made up of three realms. And so that's like this the earth, the middle realm, the land we live on, the celestial realm, or the sky, or the heavens. And then the third one is like the deep realm, the underworld, or sometimes it's expressed more as like undersea. So like continental Celtic, worldviews, Gaulish, those kinds of, parts of the Celtic spectrum, they tend to look at it more as like a vertical architecture of, heaven, earth, and the underworld. And if you look at Irish literature and tradition, kind of how that's expressed is like land, sea, and sky. But you can see that these are like variations on a theme of like there are three major divisions or like parts of the cosmos. And yeah, so what else? There's a lot to say about it.
It's a loaded question.
Yeah, like it's one of those things where Celtic worldviews tend to love to put things in threes or sort of organize the world into threes. So that's a way of expressing totality. And I think like a lot of the natural associations you might have of like underworld chthonic kind of spaces relating to ancestors and ancestral powers, darker themes, otherworld beings of the dark, those kinds of things. It's not a hell type realm. It's not a place of suffering.
Right. Or punishment.
But it right, yeah. But it what's there can be darker. That's like where the ancestral realms are as well. And then in kind of the celestial heaven space, we think of more like the gods, the shining ones, those kind of celestial powers. Yeah.
And also like I like to talk again, like to go back a little bit to the concept that like there's no punishment waiting for you on the other side. I appreciated the reminder that you began in towards the beginning of the book. You discussed that when we're talking about energy hygiene or, spiritual cleansing, we aren't talking about sin. We're not like, you must be cleansed of your evil doings. It has nothing to do with that. And it kind of was a humbling read for me because I kind of forgot that that's probably where a lot of people think we're coming from when we talk about spiritual hygiene. Like I've been in this world a while and I just I have dismissed sin so long ago that, a lot of people have that shadow work yet to do. It's a very hard construct to deconstruct.
There's a lot of stuff that, existing in an overculture that is saturated with monotheistic ideas that you have to kind of recover yourself from.
Yeah, you really do.
And sin and purity is one of those things that I think is a big one. And that's why I like to use the language of hygiene. Right? Because that's like something we do, like when we need to take a shower to wash the day off of us or whatever we've been doing, we don't really moralize about it.
No.
Most of the time. It's not like, how dare you, develop sweat and need to take a shower or whatever. Like it's not loaded in that way. It's just like, it's part of life. And I also like to think of spiritual hygiene in terms of boundary setting too, and just creating separation between things. Like now I want to separate myself from those energies and experiences because I need to be over here doing, focusing in a different way. And that helps me to kind of make that shift from moralized ways of thinking.
Well, in the vein of justice, because I feel like that is a very pervasive thread in the best way in the Magic of the Otherworld, is the importance of activism in our practice as modern witches, practitioners, sorcerers, magicians, however we label ourselves. And also, you discussed the Celtic perspective of core. Could you tell our listeners a bit about core and how that can show up for a modern practitioner?
Yeah, so using that term core, I believe that was first coined by the folks on the Story Archaeology podcast, Isolde Bralchan Carmody and Chris Thompson. So the word core basically sort of translates to rightness or justice or the proper order of things. And it's a modern way of naming a concept that really runs very strongly through Irish literature and tradition, this idea that there is a natural rightness of things. It's this idea of natural justice and the way that things should be if everything's in balance and everyone, has what they have a right to. And a lot of the stories really convey this idea that it's inherent in the natural state of the world. And that when something is wrong or goes against justice, that will be seen and felt in the condition of the world. And that there is sort of like a presence or a force that they named core, which can be kind of tapped into to power magic that is aiding that course of justice.
That gives me chills, honestly, because I think the way you said too that it affects the world, like the effects of this imbalance will be felt. Yeah. I think that kind of summarizes late 2015 up until the present day.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories that sort of illustrate this theme where, like, it's often in terms of like the sovereign, the king, or whoever is in the role of responsible leadership, making a false judgment and that being felt in the land suffers. The crops fail, the cattle suffer, people go hungry, those kinds of things are like a reflection of injustice at the heart of society, because there is this idea that justice as practiced by people can't be separated from what's happening in the land. Or you have like very direct illustrations where, like, at one point there's I think a king who is giving a judgment on a court matter that has been brought to him, and he gives kind of not the best judgment that isn't so fair, and the fortress that they're in starts sliding off the hill.
Oh, well, and in some, I know in many, the word is escaping me, but basically the kings of the land were contracted, or the words are escaping me. This is great.
Yeah.
That they had to be stewards of the land. They were supposed to work in reciprocity with the land as part of their rulership. They had to
this is this concept of sovereignty that is a big through line through the texts, the Irish literature, where, like, the idea is that sovereignty is a power that comes from the land that is sort of invested in a leader, but isn't actually theirs.
Right.
And so as long as they are continuing to merit that power through, enacting right justice, they're fine. But as soon as they become unjust or pervert or misuse that power, it is taken back from them by the goddess who sort of personifies the land.
Yeah. I love that, because it just tells us, it reminds us of the importance of stewardship. It reminds us of our relationship to the very thing that sustains us.
Yeah. And I always have a little bit of a tension when I talk about sovereignty, because, like, I'm not in favor of kings, and personally I'm closer to anarchist than anything else philosophically.
Gotcha.
But I think that without saying, like, yes, I want a king ruling me, like, the concept of the way that sovereignty comes from right relationship with the land and from enacting justice, I think that we can apply that in a way that doesn't have to translate into, like, those kinds of hierarchies. We can apply that into our understanding of our own right relationships with land and community, and how we hold our power and that kind of thing.
And even the word power. There's this essay by Elizabeth Johnson, who actually is a theologian, but this essay individually was called Women, Earth, and Creator Spirit. And it was given to a conference of, like, hard Christian theologians trying to basically get them to understand that the dualistic view of like heaven over earth is their problem, and that's why the environment is suffering. So it's a fascinating essay. It's super worth reading. I bought it in print on eBay, but I'm sure by now somebody has put it in like JSTOR or something. It's not, it's an essay. It's not overly long. But anyway, she kind of deconstructs the word stewardship and is like, basically don't use it, because if we're talking about an animistic worldview, or we're talking about like an environmental approach to our craft, because she talks about how like, and I wonder if this shows up in Celtic texts as a like a modern projection. You know what I mean? Like, because I feel like the Celtic people would have seen the earth as either equal with them or superior to them. Like, as, like there's something in the land that would be a higher purpose or a higher being, rather than something that the people are better than, that need to take care of it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I mean, this is an interesting question. Like, the literature definitely conveys this idea that like the land was seen as a material reflection of the other world, of the the spiritual realm, and it's very clear that that's where the power was understood to be. That we are sort of in the hands of these very mighty otherworld powers. They have to be appeased. We have to be in right relationship with them, because all of our prosperity and well-being comes from that. And so there is very much this recognition of kind of being held by a larger power that we have to respect and be in right relationship with. I also don't want from there to kind of make the leap to romanticizing people's relationship with the land, because there was things like deforestation and human impact, and so like I don't want to say that ancient people necessarily had the same idea we do of like we need to be in ecological harmony. Because I don't know that they
utilized the land.
They did, and like if you read some of the the mythological cycle texts that talk about like the beginning and like how the land of Ireland came to be and all that, it's a lot of this ancestral deity came and cleared 50 plains for farming, and this it's a lot of like it's a lot of clearing land for farming. So there was definitely a sense of needing to be in right relationship with the land and the sort of spiritual powers that existed within it, but not necessarily through an ecological lens in the same way that we are trying to apply today.
Makes sense.
I guess I always figure that ancient people in general would assume that the earth will bounce back, or if not, that they might not even think that far, but they might just never consider that anything they did could affect the earth negatively in such a long-standing way, which I guess most people probably think today as well. I feel like maybe not most, but quite a few people are like, it's a natural cycle. I don't know.
It's just interesting.
I'm philosophizing here.
I mean, like if you read, there's a whole group of stories that are a genre of stories called dengenicas, which means like stories of high places or stories of important places. And they're basically tales that explain why places, in the landscape look the way they do or how they got their name, right?
Oh, I love those kinds of myths.
Yeah, and so it's a lot of like this hero, fought this monster and their battle caused this, trench to be carved in the land and this hill to be thrown up, and that's why it looks like that.
Yeah.
So like there are all these stories that sort of that explain the shapes of the landscape as impacts that human ancestors had, but in a mythical way, kind of like Paul Bunyan's stories, right? Like
well, even in Greece we have the same, like, actually it's so funny, like I've never conceptualized it this way, but Hercules is a human ancestor. Alexander the Great is like, that's my great granddad. And there's these little islands called Lycandonesia. Collectively they're called one thing, the islands of Lekon, and they're right beneath the base of the mountain Hercules lived on. And the story goes that his servant Lekon came over, gave him news he didn't like, and so he hurled him, and the bumps that he made in the water are these little islands. I was just there yesterday. Like, that's so funny. Yeah, that's so fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that is something that you see in many cultures, like as sort of stories that are embedded in the landscape as ways of explaining why it looks the way it does, which is also a way of giving us a guide to relating to that landscape and a kind of face to put on it. Or there's a lot of the Kaliak built this mountain when she dropped, with all the boulders out of her apron or whatever.
Yes.
There's a lot of that kind of stuff too. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey there, witches. Did you know that there's an entire community out there dedicated to you and your journey? The Rebel Mystic community is a space where I offer my decades of knowledge and experience to witches just like you. I do this through live events, monthly mentoring, monthly rituals, a book club, and other resources like workbook pages and meditations. There is even a complete self-paced course library you can access. Check the link in the show notes to learn more about this community and how to become a member. Blessed be. So I want to talk about the wolves and the significance of wolves, because you have the wolves on the cover of your book.
Yeah.
And you talk about the she-wolves and those spirit alliances. I want to talk about the wolves.
Yeah. They're good friends of mine. And they figure really prominently in Irish myth and folklore. It's almost like it's a very symbolic animal for Ireland, even to the point where, like, in the process of being conquered by the British were sort of identifying Ireland with its wolves, and this idea that the wild Gaelic Irish were sort of compared to wolves, and as part of trying to forcibly settle the country and complete the conquest, they went on a program of like deforestation so that they could eliminate the wolves and also crush the rest of the rebellion. So it's an interesting thematic thing where like there's a lot of ancient myth and archetype around wolves, and that was sort of recognized even historically. So where to start? There's a whole tradition of people being able to shapeshift in wolf form. There is a lot of like the kind of warrior tradition, like warband culture. There seems to have been some initiatory stuff around warriors being identified with wolves, and that symbolism and relationship coming into how they were kind of trained and initiated. There are the wolves. The wolves that are on the cover of the book in particular are they're the she-wolves of Rathcrohan. Which is it's a folk tale about these otherworldly women who are, they take wolf form when they come out of this cave, which is an entrance to the other world, and when they take wolf form to go around and hunt around the landscape.
It's fascinating. I love digging into this. Wolf is even associated with my patron back. I don't know, you probably can't see her, but it's Arianrod.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So she's got the owl, the wolf, and the spider. And I love to see how it's not this solid, I am this. It's no, I'm this today and I'm going to be this tomorrow. And
yeah, especially if you're thinking of like the Morrígan, who she takes wolf shape, but that's just one of
One of them.
She's basically a shapeshifter. She's
Right.
kind of like one of the sorceresses of the gods.
Same with Caradon. Same with Caradon. And
yeah.
I love how the goddesses of this entire, I don't know, umbrella, because I mean it's so huge that they have so many different aspects, and I think that really speaks to womanhood, of how we're not just the woman who cooks and cleans and takes care of the children. We're much more than that, and I love how it links into that.
yeah. It is very complex, and it's it's one of the things I do love about these traditions is like the goddesses none of the gods reduce down simply to very simple, specific, or functional kind of archetypes. Like the Morrígan is a great example of that.
Tell us more about Morrígan.
She's often spoken of as a triple goddess, but not in the sort of sense of like maiden, mother, and crone archetypes. She
the threes again. Here we are.
yeah. So, well, I mean, this is one of these things. This is one of the misunderstandings that crops up around her and other Irish and other Celtic deities. They're often presented in groups of three, and she's not the only one. She's frequently seen with her sisters, Baive and Macha, although sometimes that configuration shifts, and there are other goddesses that are sometimes in the mix there. But the most frequent configuration is the Morrígan, Baive, and Macha as these three sisters, who are, the texts sometimes identify them as if they are aspects of one goddess. Maybe the Christian monks, had a sort of Trinitarian lens to interpret that through.
Yeah, there's a lot of theories in that.
But yeah, so she often appears with her sisters Baive and Macha as a kind of a triad. And you see that, like, there are three Bridgets. There are three craftsman gods who kind of show up together, and this idea of like three groups of three gods, I think it sort of goes back to that Celtic cosmological worldview of things existing in threes. And so when you have these triads of deities, it's a way of saying that like this divine power is existing in a form of totality, like that exists through all three realms, perhaps, or is in its fullness.
I had a question about, and you might not know the answer, we can just philosophize here, but when I was reading about, I forget the line that got me thinking about it. It was about the Morrígan, which is what made me think of this question. Okay, undeniably, the Morrígan is a powerful goddess, undeniably. So is Athena, Artemis, Hecate. However, in Greek society, women were subjugated to very specific roles. In ancient Greek, they didn't even have a word for women. They were just grouped in with chattel. So, and we see this in like Vedic history as well, like Hindu history, that like goddesses have these revered roles, but actual women didn't in society. What do we know, if anything, about Celtic women and their role in their society? I mean, I know we have like, Boudica as like a warrior, but like, is she an exception? Were there these, what was it like for women in Celtic society?
Yeah, well, we have to talk about Celtic societies.
Of course.
These are like multiple different cultures and societies that, share some cultural commonalities and related languages, right? What I would say is like women in ancient Celtic cultures, for the most part, maybe had it better than some of the other groups around them, so like if you're comparing to, say, like the Romans, they maybe had it better. They maybe had it better than they did, coming into the like medieval period, where the church has brought a lot more misogyny. That doesn't mean we would consider them liberated and equal to the extent that our standards would ask for now, you know. In Ireland, there is a set of documents called Brehon Law, which is like, it's a record of the early Irish legal system, at least from the early medieval period. It may have undergone some changes from, pagan times. So it gives us an interesting window. Like, women had rights. They could ask for divorce. They could have property. They could occupy, high status roles and such. It was sort of rare, right? So for women to be judges or rulers or those kinds of roles was uncommon. There's definitely like that familiar cultural trope of like the role of women as householding. That's definitely in there. There's the sort of cultural imaginary of gender is very, it has that traditional idea of like men are fierce and strong and warrior oriented and women are modest. But there's also a lot of stories about warrior women, and there were women judges, there were women leaders. They were just not common, they were breaking the mold. So yeah, I would say like in a comparative sense for the ancient world, Celtic women, broadly speaking, maybe had it somewhat better than some of their counterparts in neighboring cultures, but they weren't equal.
Yeah. Do you know, did women ever hold power in a magical sense? Like, could they have been sorceresses in professional capacity or a generally community respected capacity?
Yeah, there's some complexity around that.
And I know that's like, you can't know everything because our sources are so limited, but
yeah, I mean, there is definitely
curious.
like, there's a lot of material that points to, and this is not just limited to Celtic culture. You see it in like some of the Germanic, early Germanic cultures too. This idea of like a generally female gendered role who is sort of like a spiritual advisor to leadership. There's even like in the historical records about the Gauls, there's a few like high status like prophetesses who were consulted, for important advisement, and they were understood to sort of have contact with the gods and be able to do this kind of role. And sometimes they were also involved in diplomacy. So you have that. You have in the early Irish text, there's a lot of stuff about like women as who you would go to for the highest level of martial training. So like, there were certain like warrior women that were supposed to have like operated schools for training warriors, like Scatha. She sort of was very famous.
That's
although
so cool.
Yeah,
it is so cool.
you can argue whether that's mythological or was a historical reality, but certainly like there is definitely this idea that sorcery and prophecy and these kinds of spiritual powers and roles, there's definitely identification of that with women. Yeah, it's a theme for sure. Fedalm, the poetess, prophetess who
Yeah, I loved reading about her in your book.
yeah, she sort of is an Irish example of kind of an archetype that you see in a lot of the Celtic cultures.
That's wonderful. That's really good. That's cool. Okay, that's much more positive than I was predicting. So that's awesome. One of the things I loved about your book was the structure.
Yeah.
Particularly how you ended ended or just had in there. Maybe it wasn't always the last section, but when you give us a topic, you would kind of wrap it up with a story of putting that into practice. And that's, I think, if there's like one thing that makes your book like 100% worth buying, it's probably that, because you're giving people useful rituals, but you're literally like, okay, in present tense, I begin in the dim light of my shrine room. Like, it's amazing. It draws you in. It's like we're there with you, and it removes so much like confusion, or like some of the questions that I get often is like, but how do I do that? What does it look like if I do this? You know, I loved that structure. It was really good.
I'm glad it was helpful. I had nervousness about like how to present that material, and actually initially in my first draft I just had those stories and I didn't have the like how to, ritual sections. Because I was like, I don't really want to do like the recipe book, like step by step how to do this ritual, because there's so many different ways to use the material and so many different ways you could apply it, and I don't want to lock people into a method. And so at first I was just going to give those personal stories, as examples, as illustrations of what it could look like. And my editors at Llewellyn really pushed for me to also add some instructions, and I'm glad they did, because I think when you put those things together, it's really helpful. Like, here's a step by step if you don't know how to begin, but also here's an example of how it can look a lot of different ways. And that's really what I was going for, is like, I really want, my goal was to sort of help people develop a toolkit of their own and feel empowered and recognize their own autonomy and how they work with this material.
Yeah, you nailed it.
Yes. It's great.
Awesome.
Objective achieved.
It always feels a little, it feels risky to put your own personal stories out there in a book that's going to be seen by lots of people, but
yeah, and it's so hard to be vulnerable like that, and it's hard to know what's too privileged to share, like we've even recorded episodes where in the moment, especially when it's just me and Leandra, like we share something a little too far, and then we're like, oh wait, you know what, in editing we're going to remove that story. Yeah.
The gods are alive here in Greece, waiting to share the wisdom of the old ways with you. I'm calling in the sacred travelers to join me on private day retreats this summer in Greece. Call on the oracle and be anointed in the Pythia's sacred spring at Delphi. Find empowerment at the Temple of Artemis. Descend within at the temples of the Eleusinian mysteries. Swim in a goddess temple. Then let my drum guide you into the goddess cave. And so much more. If you are ready to meet the land spirits of Greece's most sacred sites, visit seekingnumina.com/in-person tours to view my packages today.
So I feel like it would be remiss not to discuss the funerary practices that you describe a little bit. The story of your sudden keening actually really moved me. And it's something that I've experienced but never had the words to. I didn't know what keening was. And I feel like there's just so much missing. This is something I actually been writing on a little bit myself in general, like that I feel like so much is lacking in modern funerary tradition and in the pagan world and otherwise. The pagan world does its best, but we're limited by society and our upbringing. And like we said, this overculture. So could you just describe what keening is? Because for me, that really stood out, but also in general, a bit about the Celtic funerary tradition.
Yeah. So the keening that I talk about in the book, I always sort of want to give the disclaimer, like I wasn't taught in the traditional keening practices, of Ireland or any particular culture. Like that happened to me as a, like, the spirits asked for it and sort of showed me what to do. And the story that I share in the book is that I was at a pagan event beside a lake, and late in the evening, I just sort of was feeling very pulled to this lake, like there was something going on with it and spiritually, and I just sort of like sat down beside the lake and fell into a trance and experienced a sort of overwhelming feeling that the spirits were needing to be keened in order to be released, that there was like some spirits stuck or trapped in that place. It's hard to describe, but I just sort of knew, right? And so I just started allowing this keening to come out of me, and it's essentially it's wailing. It's like keening traditions exist like in various cultures around the world, and Ireland is one of those places that had a funerary keening tradition. And there, what it is like, it's essentially like funerary lament that usually would start with like a praise song, a sort of funerary lament of praise for the deceased, that then can, like, it transitions from a song into just wailing, like just emotive wailing. And it can become quite intense. Like the wailing can become quite intense, and it did for me in the form that the spirits kind of led me to. it just becomes this kind of formless wailing, and the way that I experience it is as a spirit practice, where like the force of emotion that you are allowing to come through you and be expressed in the voice is actually like tearing a hole between the worlds for spirits to cross. That's how I experienced it. It sometimes can almost feel violent.
That's so powerful.
Yeah, it's very intense, or it can be very intense. I, like I said, haven't experienced it from a traditional practice perspective. But you can read about the keening tradition in Ireland. It was, the church kind of really sort of tried to put its foot down on it and eventually mostly succeeded by like the mid 20th century. Most keening practices had kind of, like the last remaining few people that had the keening practice were being interviewed and stuff. And, basically like it was a women's thing. Like there were professional keeners who would be brought to funerals to do this, and they would know how to do these funeral songs, and then they would know how to transition that into the lament and the wailing. And it I don't know, I guess the church didn't like the women being in charge of something.
How dare they not have control?
That's really upsetting to me that it lasted that long and is still lost. Like we're talking like 3 generations ago. It's gone. I know. That's it.
Yeah.
That's
and I don't know if it's completely gone, but like I think people are trying to revive it in Ireland. Like there are some people trying to bring it back. From the tidbits of tradition that remain, and from the recordings and what was kind of gathered about it. And, like there is a sense in the tradition that it isn't just about emotion and song and performance, that there is something being done for the spirits, that you're opening a road or some aspect of it helps the spirits to cross. And you even sort of see that in the way that it's talked about in the early texts. Like there's this sense that like it is important for a person to be bewailed. That's how it's phrased in some of these translations, that if a person is not properly mourned, they don't have the correct funeral rites, and they aren't keened for, their spirit could become stuck and become like kind of an unsettled, revenant dead person.
Well, and think about how relevant that is to how we mourn today. Specifically, um, when we go to a funeral, everybody's quiet. Like there's nobody sobbing really. If you're sobbing, it's somehow inappropriate, even though that's the place to do it. And then we're like rushed through the grief process. Like, oh, just get over it. That was last week, like, whoa, wait.
I agree. I feel like there's a need for, like, one of the things that the keening does. I mean, it's multifunctional, right? Like it opens a spirit road and helps the spirits to cross.
Like that.
But it also has a role for the bereaved and for the community, especially when it is, somebody who is not the immediate bereaved who's leading that keening. It can kind of give people permission to emote, or it can be a way of vicariously expressing grief that individual people might or might not be able to access for themselves. And yeah, so I feel like it's really powerful in that sense. And I do feel like a lot of our, conventional funeral processes lack that. Like in American culture, at least, there's a very you're sort of meant to be proper in your grief.
Right.
Like if somebody breaks down crying, it's very much like, oh, let's try not to be disruptive.
Right. We're more concerned about stopping them than letting them just move through it. And any emotion takes 90 seconds to move through. If we're spending too much time in it, then we're ruminating, we're stuck. So if we can't allow ourselves to flow like water, if we stop the water, it's going to dam up and then the dam's going to burst eventually. So let's move towards a different practice.
Yeah. It seems to have been understood in Ireland that like there was a need for that keening and that emoting, and for the spirit to receive the honor of that, of being keened in that way or bewailed, that it would help them to get where they need to go.
Yeah. In Coptic Christianity, and I don't know this for sure because I've actually never been to a funeral in Greece, but in my understanding is that Greek Orthodoxy as well, there is like a wailing process. But I have been to a Coptic funeral by accident. We were in Egypt. I'm part of the Greek Egyptian diaspora, so it's like it's basically a small cultural exchange community between the two countries. So I have family in Egypt as well, and we were visiting them when I was a kid, and we were in a church, and the funeral started. They were actually, I guess, maybe finishing it because they were coming in they did like a circle around the church. So they were at that point in the ritual, wherever that would be, the liturgy, as they would say. It's obviously a ritual, but it has a history that's more grounded in place and folk tradition than it is in Christianity. I wouldn't, bet money on this, but I don't necessarily think it's in any Christian literature, Bible wise. I think it is something cultural that was enveloped by Christianity. So it's actually, it's just, it bums me out because like these are the origin Christians, Coptics, like that's the first language the Bible was like formally written in. And the fact that like Christians of a different type were like, no, we don't wail anymore is even worse, honestly, when you think of it. Because like Christianity doesn't inherently disprove that. That was something political, Yeah,
I'm vaguely aware of that, Greece definitely had or has a whaling tradition. It's one of the things that like in literature about Irish keening, it gets compared to.
Exactly. I know like certainly the Epirus region has a pagan. Yeah, like there's a region that actually did have a method of writing music. It wasn't quite, the way we do it with like half notes and whole notes and all that, but it was that kind of thing. So we can actually play their music exactly. And they do have a lamentation tradition that sometimes gets performed. So but not for a funeral, but just like performed. So I have seen that performed, but I'm not sure what the Greek Orthodox do, but I just can't imagine, like, it's such an expressive culture. I can't imagine that they would shut down crying, because even weddings, people are like just blowing their nose loudly and so excited and happy, so.
Yeah. And I have the impression that in some Muslim cultures, there's a very vivid keening tradition, or I'm not sure if that's the right, nomenclature in that context, but that they do wailing practices in funerary processions and such. Yeah.
They do. That's true. They do. I don't have Muslim family, but I lived in the Middle East when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to participate in a lot of various cultural funerals, weddings, passings of things,
I mean, I think that kind of lamentation and wailing is a very natural thing.
It's an urge, it's an impulse.
And and in a funerary context. And so you do see it in a lot of cultures worldwide, and just, places where some of our institutions have tried to crush it. It has been lost in some places.
Is there a time where it's too late to do keening for somebody? Like because if somebody's listening to this and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm still grieving over so-and-so's death. Can I keen for them now, even though it's been X amount of time? Is it too late? Can they still do this?
If there is a traditional boundary around that, I don't know it. That on that point, I can't necessarily speak for any particular cultural tradition. I haven't run across that in the scholarly literature about Irish keening. I think, it is more traditional for it to happen at the funeral. But I don't know if that's a question anyone has really asked. Myself, I have certainly been invited by spirits to keen for them a long time past, whenever their death occurred. But like I said, my practice of keening exists outside of any particular traditional context. I wasn't taught it. I was just invited to do it by the spirits. And so I don't know, I'm a rogue keener.
Rebel.
I'll keen for spirits where if it's too late for them to get a proper funeral ritual.
That's a good bumper sticker. Yeah. Will keen for spirits if it's too late to get a proper funeral ritual.
I like it.
Are you enjoying the show? If you are, we'd really appreciate a 5-star review. It helps us to reach more listeners like you and to keep doing the Magick Kitchen podcast. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. I could talk to you for many, many, many hours. And
likewise.
I hope we get to talk again and maybe even meet on this plane, on this live.
Yeah,
someday.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate the invitation.
Well, yeah.
And I look forward to your next books.
Yes,
definitely.
So tell our listeners where they can find you and how they can connect with you or buy your books.
Yeah, so my website has all of my links on it, and it's bansheearts.com, BANSHEE arts.com. And so from there, you can find, my various social medias. I have a little newsletter. You can sign up to get emails, see what I'm up to. My books are available, wherever, whatever online book retailer you might like to order from, bookshop.org, Amazon, whatever, or you can also order signed copies from me directly if I have them in stock, which I do right now, The Magic of the Otherworld. So, and then you can also order directly from Llewellyn, or my other publisher for my first book is Concrescent Press. And that's me. Do you want to hear what my next book is going to be about?
Yes. Oh my gosh.
I do.
I'm working on a book about ritual tattooing.
Yes, that's so cool. That's so cool.
I'm excited about it because I'm terrified of tattoos. I've always wanted to get one, but I'm terrified of them. So I need to read it. I need you to guide me in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next time we talk, we'll talk about that.
Yeah. Because I don't have any
day job.
I have no tattoos because they would need to be that special for me because I'm
Yes.
just not, I don't know. I don't like really wear makeup. I don't know. I don't dye my hair. I feel very weird about like adjusting my body. Like, I think I took like all those lessons of like, you're perfect just the way you are, like way too far in my mind.
Nothing wrong
like,
with that.
Even for my wedding, I didn't wear makeup and people were like, what are you doing? You have to wear makeup.
That's a
like,
valid
I wore,
choice.
Yeah. So, but I think tattooing is so different. It's like, it can be so powerful. So, I can't wait to read it.
That's just a little
You're coming
teaser.
back on if you don't mind. We would love to have you back on for that.
Love to.
Merry meet,
Merry part, and merry meet again.
Thank you for joining us on the Magick Kitchen podcast. Please visit my website, leandrawitchwood.com, for news, information, and more episodes.
I'm Elyse Wells, and I can be found at Seeking Numina on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and seekingnumina.com. That's Seeking, Numina.